So, thank you. Thank you for coming. This is the first CMS Policy Speaker Series of 2020, and we expect to have many more, and at least have one monthly, like we used to have. If you have any recommendations of speakers that you want to get to see, please send me an email. You can take a look at all of the speakers that we have had and all of the talks at the CMS website, that is carbon.nasa.gov, and you can go to applications and you can see the policy speaker series there. So before introducing today's speakers, I just wanted to make a couple of announcements on the side of CMS. As you, or some of you may not know, there is a new call for proposals for CMS out. And the notice of intent, the deadline is August 31, and the submission deadline is in October 16, and you can find more information about that also in the CMS website. I don't know if Peter, here with the Carbon Cycle and Ecosystems Office, if you want to add anything else.
I think the main thing with the CMS solicitations is that in addition to any kind of new ideas, it also calls for continuity of successful previous efforts. With the due date being in October, the new teams will not be selected in time for the CMS Science Team meeting, which will be in November in Boulder. So we'll have stakeholders, of course, and then the 2018 and 2016 round of projects participating in that. Headquarters indicated that things went really well. There could be a selection, a potential review of proposals in January and
Of 2021.
2021, and yeah, not of 2022. And then selection sometime in, maybe March if everything went smoothly. If you happen not to have conflicts of interest with CMS, people who are proposing to CMS, and you're contacted as a peer reviewer by headquarters, please give it your best effort to serve as a peer reviewer. It's always very challenging to put the panels together.
Thank you, Peter. And we also have the NACP, North American Carbon Program, Open Science Meeting that is coming up in March. I think registration is still open, right?
Sorry. Yes, the NACP meeting is happening March 23rd to 26th. You can register up until the day the meeting starts. We are still accepting some poster submissions until the 4th of this month, so just Wednesday, a couple days from now. We have a little bit of space left, so we thought we'd try and squeeze in some more. So there's more information on the NACP website, which is just nacarbon.org, and then you can find the meeting website there.
Okay. Thank you, Libby. And we also have several workshops and meetings that we are planning on the side of applications on CMS. There is a U.S. Forest Service NASA Joint Applications Workshop that we are coordinating with other NASA Applied Sciences missions. So stay tuned. That's going to be the first week of June. And as I just mentioned, you can just go to carbon.nasa.gov applications, and you're going to see all of the information there. So with that done, I would like to present today's speakers. Alex Rudee, coming from WRI, World Resources Institute. He's an associate for carbon removal at WRI, and his work includes research on carbon removal pathways in forestry and agriculture, technical assistance to state and federal policymakers, and partnerships with businesses and other stewards on watershed stewardship. So today's presentation is going to be focused on a paper that was released by WRI recently, just this last month, that is titled CarbonShot, Federal Policy Options for Carbon Removal in the United States. And he is also going to mention areas where NASA carbon scientists can contribute to filling research and data needs in this topic of carbon removal. And Alex has been involved in one of the CMS projects with Dr. George Hurt, University of Maryland. It's a project on high-resolution carbon monitoring for northeastern states, and we are discussing with CMS applications on the potential of doing a one-day workshop on this topic of carbon removal with other federal government agencies. So this is something that we're gonna be discussing, and we're gonna stay here after his talk to discuss. So if you have any feedback about that, you're welcome to give that. So we're gonna have time for a Q&A after his presentation. So I'll just leave you with Alex. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Adil. And it's great to be here. Thanks, everyone, for your interest in the topic. I'm sure it's more than just the pizza that you're interested in here today. It's been really fantastic to get to know more about the carbon monitoring program and to participate in the science team meeting last fall, and now to be here sharing the work that my team has been doing on carbon removal, and great to see that there's such a wide audience for that, even outside the Washington Beltway. So this is really exciting. Again, I'm Alex Rudee. I'm an associate with the World Resources Institute. I focus, my kind of area of expertise is primarily on the natural side approaches that I'll be talking about today, but I'll be covering a bit about both natural and technological sides of carbon removal.
Yes. So
We have a robot in the room.
So we're just barely. So for the people that are on the line, can you mute yourself using *6?
Don't you have?
Do you think it's one of your devices?
You know what? There's a code. I think it's star 96. Star 96.
Would you like your guests to be able to unmute their own line by pressing *6? If yes, press 1. If no, press 2. All guests have been muted. You will now rejoin the meeting.
Sorry for that.
Okay, no problem.
That's a pro tip.
Super. All right. No more robot echoes in the room. Great. So our latest research is all about creating options at the federal policy level for carbon removal at scale in the United States. And I wanted to start with just a bit of context. I'm sure this is stuff that many, if not all of you, are already familiar with. But just to set the scene, there's a growing recognition now that if we want to stay within a kind of a safe level of temperature rise, about 1.5 degrees Celsius, reducing greenhouse gas emissions is not going to be enough. The IPCC made this clear in their recent report on 1.5 degrees. We're going to not only need to reduce emissions, but also to remove carbon from the atmosphere in order to get to net zero emissions globally by mid-century, which is what scientists say is needed to stay within that 1.5 degree trajectory. So obviously, nothing I'm talking about here today is meant to take the place of reducing emissions as steeply and as quickly as we can. We know we need to do that, but we also know there's going to likely be some residual emissions here in the blue from sectors that are harder to abate. And in order to offset those, we'll need to remove carbon out of the atmosphere through one or many different approaches to reach net zero, and then of course to go net carbon negative as we move toward the end of the century and restore CO2 to safe levels in the atmosphere. So carbon removal is still relatively a new topic, but just in the last couple years it's actually gotten a lot of publicity. Here's a selection of reports that have come out just since 2018. On the left is actually the first part of the World Resources Institute's CarbonShot series, 3 papers that kind of tackle foundational questions around different kinds of carbon removal that we came out with in fall of 2018. Since then, we've seen an extensive research and development agenda come out from the National Academy of Sciences. We have a policy assessment from the Rhodium Group on scaling direct air capture technology, and a broader RD&D initiative and management plan on carbon removal technologies from the Energy Future Initiatives. Today I'll be talking about our newest addition to the literature on federal policy priorities. We released that report just over a month ago, did an event on Capitol Hill talking about many of the same things that I'll talk about today, and got a really great reception, so it's great to be able to spread the message even further. I have here a full copy of the report, which in the interest of saving paper we didn't print a whole lot of, but you can find the full text of the report online. I also brought some of the executive summaries around, which I see some folks have taken a look at already. So I'm going to be presenting today the major findings from this federal policy report. What we've done in this paper is try to identify the highest priority policy steps that Congress could take now to set up the United States to deliver carbon removal at the scale that we think is needed in the coming decades. So our first step in doing that was to benchmark exactly what that scale would be. Then to map out the different options and pathways for carbon removal that could help us get there, and develop policy options for each according to a set of basic principles I'll talk about a bit later. Lastly, we constructed deployment scenarios to help evaluate the pros and cons of different portfolio makeups.
So are you considering only the amount of carbon that the United States puts in, or is this an attempt at solving the world problem?
That's a great question. Our analysis here is limited to what the United States can do. I'll talk about how we kind of benchmark the scale of that. This is obviously toward contributing our share of what we think would be needed to keep the globe on a kind of a safe 1.5 degree pathway. But of course, there's knock-on effects. If U.S. develops technologies, those can be transferred internationally, and this can help other countries think about roadmaps, although the circumstances aren't going to look exactly the same.
So the implication is that other countries will do a similar kind of, make a similar kind of effort?
Eventually, yes. I think that would be the goal. I know we're at a different stage here at emission reductions, and we have kind of different energy mix and different opportunities in the U.S. than in other, especially developing countries. So this is really targeted just at the U.S. But I think in the long term, or really in the medium term, we're not talking so super long term anymore at all. These kinds of solutions would start to become relevant globally, and I think you're already seeing that, especially on the natural side, that these kinds of ideas are picking up traction all over the world.
So the scale is just the United States for our share of...
That's correct. That's correct. And I'll move on to that first piece right now, which is benchmarking the scale of likely carbon removal need in the U.S. So to do that, we turn to the mid-century strategy for deep decarbonization, which was published by the White House in 2015 under the Obama administration. And that mapped out pathways for driving down greenhouse gas emissions across the U.S. economy by 2050. So their modeling resulted in about 2.5 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent left unabated by 2050. That's what you see here in the blue and the red. And then the green is the carbon that's currently offset by the forest sink in the U.S. Right now, forests offset about or sequester 700 and odd million tons of carbon dioxide per year. That's projected to decrease a little bit as forests age and the sequestration rates go down, and as land conversion out of forest accelerates in the next 20, 30 years. So with the projection of where the forest sink is at, we estimate there will be a residual need of about 2 billion tons or 2 gigatons per year that we would need to remove from the atmosphere in order to get to net zero. Now, we recognize we may need more carbon removal than that if we wait to act on the recommendations of the mid-century strategy, or if we're less than successful in actually achieving the emissions reductions that it lays out. On the flip side, you can imagine a future in which we actually need less carbon removal if new technological advancements actually enable deeper cuts in what we now consider to be hard to abate sectors of the economy. But we think, at least as a risk management proposition, the U.S. should be equipped to remove at least 2 gigatons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere by 2050. So the next thing we did is identify pathways and estimate the potential that these different pathways for carbon removal could have by 2050. We first canvassed the literature to see where scientists and researchers right now believe the potential is at. Then we deconstructed those estimates and put them back together again using our own set of assumptions as far as reasonable safeguards on these different approaches and constraints on their likely deployment. So just as an example of what I mean by that, we have a pathway here labeled tree restoration, which includes reforestation as well as other methods of putting trees back on the landscape. So in that pathway, we took out any assumption that we would be reforesting agricultural lands since we want to be cognizant about not interfering with food production in the United States. So that potential we would remove from the estimate, but then we would add in other ways to restore trees to the landscape, like integrating trees into pasture lands without reducing livestock production through silvopasture techniques, or restocking existing forests that are right now deemed less than healthy and less than fully stocked by the Forest Service. So the bright colored bars represent a range of low to high deployment scenario given kind of plausible assumptions about deployment by 2050. And then the top end of the lighter bars here is the upper bound carbon removal with safeguards. So think of that as like a technical potential. So again, just to use the tree restoration as an example, if every acre that we've deemed suitable for tree restoration was restored with trees, we think we could get a little over 0.5 gigaton of carbon dioxide removal per year. But given some inevitable level of tree mortality and what we expect to be some landowner preferences for other land use types in those areas, we think a more plausible range to shoot for is between 180 and 360 million tons per year. That's about 1/3 to 2/3 of the potential there. There's going to be different assumptions kind of baked into these other pathways as well. So rather than ranking the options on different criteria, we actually binned them into categories based on what we think are key common characteristics. And the first kind of bin or categories are what are the staples in the carbon removal portfolio. These are the most critical pathways to scale up over the coming decades. And we think the staples include tree restoration and direct air capture, which, for anyone who doesn't know, is a technology where you actually pull CO2 out of the air using chemical solvents or sorbents, and then use a source of heat energy to extract the carbon dioxide, and it can be either used in fuels or materials or sequestered permanently underground. So direct air capture and tree restoration both have reasonably clear technical potential, and it's outsized relative to other pathways, especially when you look at potential cumulative removals through 2050. They're both on the range between 6 and 8 gigatons cumulatively by 2050. So even though trees are ultimately constrained in how much carbon they can remove on an annual basis, just because of kind of available land area, the difference is that we can start deploying trees on the landscape right now, whereas technologies like direct air capture will take 10 to 20 years of R&D before they're really ready to deploy at scale. And so if you look over the next 30 years, trees are going to be able to provide the most cumulative removals.
So are you taking into account the destruction of forests that's taking place in part due to climate change?
Yeah, that's a really good question. This is not a comprehensive list of things we can do in the biosphere or in technology development to help us get to that net zero point. We're strictly looking at carbon removal, ways we can actually pull carbon out of the atmosphere. There's other things we can do, like preventing deforestation, or obviously accelerating renewable energy that help reduce emissions. That's a key measures to pair with these, and I'll actually talk about that stuff a little bit later. But for the purposes of our core analysis, we limited the scope to physical carbon removal from the atmosphere. Yes.
So for the bioenergy, what kind of fuels are you talking about later?
I'll touch on that a bit later. Yeah, I'll go through each of these as kind of their categorical form. So the next bin that we looked at is no regrets, and that we think that term really applies well to agricultural soil carbon because the potential for carbon removal here appears meaningful, but it's ultimately constrained and subject to higher scientific uncertainty. We just don't have a very strong sense of carbon fluxes in any given acre of agricultural soils. However, the cost for practices that would contribute to soil sequestration are relatively low. It's relatively affordable, and the pathway brings significant co-benefits. So even if we can't say what the carbon impacts of a particular soil management technique are on a given acre, we can see that it benefits soil health and water quality, and in many cases even farm productivity. So all of that justifies investment in this pathway, despite the uncertainty around the net greenhouse gas benefits there. The third category we looked at are what we call speculative bets. This includes carbon mineralization, which is essentially a process to enhance or accelerate natural processes of weatherization between carbon dioxide in the air and reactive rocks. That can be suitable for end products like concrete aggregate, and then enhanced root crops, where you're actually genetically growing crops that have deeper root systems that sequester more carbon. For both of these pathways, we think the upper bound carbon removal potential is outsized, making the options worth continued research and development. But what we can achieve is kind of poorly understood given technical and economic unknowns, and that makes these more speculative than other options. The final kind of bin here of carbon removal pathways are what we're calling supplemental. That includes bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, which to your question could come either from kind of residual agricultural products or potentially dedicated crops, although the life cycle emissions then are different. And then wood waste preservation, where you're burying kind of mainly wood used in construction to keep the carbon sequestered, or extending timber rotations. Across all of these pathways, we see relatively modest potential compared to some of the other ones, and or high cost, and a relative lack of co-benefits for the environment, which diminishes the case for prioritizing these pathways. We recognize that taken together, some of these pathways could contribute meaningfully to an overall carbon removal portfolio, but in the interest of prioritization, we've chosen to focus our policy development on the pathways here on the left-hand side. So now I'll move to kind of the policy section of our paper. And in developing these policy recommendations, we started by systematically identifying barriers to deployment or deployment readiness of the pathways. We then focused on ways that policy could address those barriers, and in particular, turning first to existing policy models rather than trying to reinvent the wheel to determine solutions that would actually work for these pathways. We tried to develop options that would yield rapid gains and would maximize the return on investment of taxpayer money here, since we are talking about public resources. Our objective here is not to catalog all possible policy approaches, but to winnow it down to a small handful of what we think are simple, practical, and actionable policy solutions that would be most impactful. So with all that in mind, we came up with 4 basic to-dos for Congress that I will describe here. The first one is a subsidy for tree restoration. So we know there's more room on the landscape for trees to replant or regenerate trees, but we also know that that costs money. Unless we plan to harvest the trees down the line, the cost of planting likely exceeds the benefits that any individual landowner would see from this activity. So there's no clear private economic case for doing this. But we also know there's an immense public benefit. Trees, obviously, in addition to sequestering carbon, provide a variety of ecosystem services, from water filtration to soil stability to biodiversity habitat, and all that justifies a significant public investment in this pathway. Based on our analysis, we think we could plant 60 billion trees over the next 20 years. That's not quite 1 trillion trees, but it is a large chunk. To do that, we would need a public subsidy, which could be akin to what we do for the solar industry right now with an investment tax credit for restoring trees to the landscape. We could also route funds through a direct cost share program, similar to how USDA now compensates farmers and other producers for conservation practices. Or we could do state grants for states that meet targets on tree restoration. But whichever policy avenue we choose, there's a few kind of guidelines we think this policy needs to have. First, we need to push past the direct-to-landowner model of subsidies because we don't think that will really catalyze the scale of action we need across the landscape. We need to be able to reduce transaction costs and bring in small landowners, and where possible, crowd in other sources of finance in addition to federal funding. So to do that, we think we need to spark an industry around tree restoration on the landscape. And that means allowing third-party intermediaries, project developers, land trusts, it could even be local governments. Any of those kinds of third parties would need to be able to access federal funding for this and then contract with individual landowners to put trees back on the landscape. We also think the policy here, of course, needs to have appropriate safeguards to make sure we're planting the right trees in the right places, to make sure that we're making progress over baseline levels of replanting on timber operations, and of course, to make sure that trees that we're planting actually survive and grow to maturity. The second policy would be a technology development program for direct air capture. This policy would have two essential components. The first is public technology development at the Department of Energy to advance early stage innovations that could reduce cost and improve scalability of direct air capture systems, things like new materials and new components. And I actually want to highlight here a potential link with NASA research efforts to design carbon dioxide removal technologies for life support systems in spacecraft. I know this is outside the realm of the earth sciences, but it is a NASA link. Public funding is now starting to come in for a Mars mission, which could really direct more resources toward this kind of technology development. And as that comes in, we should be thinking about ways that sort of technology development and research can also be leveraged for applications right here on Earth. Direct air capture, whether you're keeping a spacecraft livable or keeping our atmosphere safe, is a key technology and merits a lot of direct public investment for new innovation. That said, the other essential component of this policy would be catalyzing private sector deployment experience. So in order to galvanize an industry around the technology, we need to increase current tax credits for deployment. There's a 45Q tax credit right now for carbon capture and sequestration. We think the value of that credit for direct air capture needs to rise up. I think it's now around 45 or 50 bucks a ton. We think it would need to be about $180 a ton in order to really make the economics work for some of these new startup companies that are starting to build demonstration projects here. The third policy that we looked at for agricultural soil carbon is an on-farm innovation program. This enterprise would pair financial and technical assistance to landowners who implement soil health practices like cover cropping or conservation tillage with rigorous monitoring and research to advance our scientific understanding of what practices work for carbon sequestration and where they work. USDA is actually already piloting a similar approach that was enacted in the most recent Farm Bill. It's called the Soil Health Demonstration Trials. That program is right now funded about $25 million. We think that could increase 20-fold to $500 million to help us get 10 million acres enrolled in this program, experimenting and innovating on different practices in the landscape and sending data back to USDA to analyze the efficacy. That scale of operation would allow scientists to draw robust statistical inferences about what practices are effective at sequestering carbon on a variety of different regions and environmental circumstances.
Okay, another question.
Sure.
So the USDA has just lost their entire unit that does the analysis of climate change effects on the food supply.
You're talking about the
300
agriculture.
scientists that were sent to Missouri or Kansas, whatever that was. So I'm wondering, does the USDA have the horsepower to manage a program like this if all their scientists and economists are
So, sure. So,
gone?
Can you repeat the question?
sure. The question was about recent losses of capacity at USDA and whether they would have the bandwidth to implement a program like this. Certainly a larger program would require additional staff capacity. The Soil Health Demonstration Trial Program is run through the Natural Resource Conservation Service, NRCS. They're actually a largely distributed body already. 90% of their staff is in field offices all around the country, not in a DC or other central location. They're the ones that work with farmers directly on the ground to implement practices, and they could be instrumental in kind of helping them collect the data on that. There's also within our NRCS a program called the National Resources Inventory, or NRI, that currently monitors different soil characteristics across, I think, 800,000 plots around the country. They could include a carbon measurement in that system, which they currently don't, in order to help us get a really robust baseline of carbon. So the short answer is yes, I think they could. Certainly there's power that's, potentially has been lost at USDA thanks to some of the recent moves. But for this application, I think the departments or agencies within USDA that would be implementing it, not that it would be easy, but it would be possible to scale up to that level.
I just wanted to add, we have several questions online, but we're going to keep it.
Okay, sure, and we will do a Q&A session at the end,
Okay,
so we keep on time.
Just referring to this as reduced capacity at USDA, Alex is correct. NRCS is the lead on these issues, and they haven't been downsized at all.
Great, thanks Keith, glad he's tuning in.
One question. So does the agroforestry practice come under the Farm Innovation Program?
That's a good question. So we actually looked at agroforestry in the context of tree restoration, where you can integrate trees with pasture land or with croplands. But certainly I think it's also part of a farm innovation enterprise because these practices are not practiced very widely on the landscape. So in terms of our analysis, we kind of grouped it in the tree bucket, but the policies I think would both apply there.
They're probably safe because it's not called climate.
Right, and that's kind of another level of analysis is how you actually message this stuff to the producers and to the people on the ground who would be implementing it. We're engaged in a follow-on project now looking at that in rural communities and with rural stakeholders, and I think you're exactly right. There's so many co-benefits and other reasons, both environmental and economic, to pursue many of these approaches that in some circles, if that's not the right way to message it, you don't really need to talk about the carbon or climate impacts. Sure. Mm-hmm. I just want to touch quickly on the fourth and final policy prescription that we arrived at, and that's research, development, and demonstration for emerging carbon removal technologies. We identified two discrete priorities here, the most critical research funding for carbon mineralization and enhanced root crops, but we really do need to seek out broader options and push boundaries across the entire portfolio. So the Energy Futures Initiative actually just released a report with a totally mapped out management plan on exactly how this kind of federal effort would work. I direct anyone interested in kind of more details to their report, since they really covered it nicely. If you put all of our federal recommendations together, then this is visually what the balance of federal investment would look like. You see it's about $6 billion in total, with $4 to $4.5 billion of that going to the tree restoration wedge. Now, the reason that that looks so big right now is because we actually need to overcome the cost of deploying trees on the landscape right now. As we look forward in time, beyond 2030, this is just for the next 10 years, but beyond 2030, you'd see the balance start to strongly shift toward more money for the technologies as they're becoming ready for deployment and deployed at scale in the US. The last piece of the paper that I really want to dive into here with this audience is several elements of a broader enabling environment that we think would be critical to facilitate action at scale on the carbon removal pathways that I just touched on. So it's important to note that many of those carbon removal pathways, as some folks have already gleaned, that they would interact with emitting sectors. So for example, direct air capture needs to run on low carbon sources of energy, or kind of defeats the point. Bioenergy with carbon capture and storage could have knock-on benefits by displacing emissions from fossil fuel fired power, but it could also have indirect climate impacts the other way if, for example, bioenergy crops displace food production and contribute to deforestation in other land area. So developing abundant sources of low carbon energy, producing credible life cycle assessments to guide policy, and enhancing land use efficiency by increasing agricultural productivity and protecting natural lands like forests are all important measures to manage these interactions between sectors. We will also need enhanced methods and expanded infrastructure for transporting, using, and storing carbon dioxide. And finally, better monitoring capabilities for natural carbon capture are critical to measuring impact and targeting policies to the area with the most potential for carbon removal. So NASA is uniquely positioned here to advance these monitoring capabilities, and I'd like to dive a little bit deeper into our specific suggestions there. Within the natural carbon capture monitoring umbrella, we grouped our suggestions into 4 broad needs. That includes more robust sampling networks for carbon and biomass and soils. It includes remote sensing and integration of remote sensing tools into existing carbon monitoring tools. More granular monitoring of carbon management practices. And finally, data systems to make all of these data accessible to researchers all in one place. And I just want to flag, unlike our major policy recommendations that I just touched on, I'm calling these suggestions rather than recommendations because we didn't go through the exercise of prioritizing the most important things for Congress to do. This is just a number of suggestions based on research in the literature and expert consultations, but they're not necessarily in a priority order here. So as you can see, there's a lot here that the government could do, from, on the left-hand side, more frequent sampling in the Forest Inventory and Analysis Program. And I mentioned before, carbon measurement in the National Resources Inventory Program for soils, all the way over here to enhancement of USDA landowner surveys and the like. Several of these policy recommendations come straight from the National Academies and their recent R&D plan for negative emissions technologies. I've marked with an asterisk where we're drawing on their recommendations here. So as you might guess, there's a lot here that's really under USDA purview, but I want to focus specifically on some of the pieces here that I believe fit more squarely within the NASA mission. Certainly we can have a more open discussion about where else folks here might see relevancies for NASA. But as first, I wanted to focus in on this remote sensing bucket where I think there's a lot that NASA can do. So as a first suggestion, we know that LiDAR data can be a powerful, cost-effective way to estimate carbon stocks in trees and forests, of course, when it's calibrated with FIA or other kind of field-based data. But right now, LiDAR coverage is patchy in the US, and to have the most impact, what we really need is LiDAR data that's regularly updated to provide a current baseline. The JEDI program, if it's renewed, would be well suited to fill that need. And then whether you're working with JEDI or another remote sensing product like 3D imagery, remote sensing data needs to be integrated into our current methods for estimating forest carbon fluxes. Of course, forests are the largest carbon sink in the US and control a lot of the balance of carbon sequestration and emissions in the land sector. Right now, forest carbon is estimated solely based on FIA field data, but incorporating remote sensing would allow us to better pinpoint changes on the landscape in space and in time. That becomes even more important as we're increasingly managing sudden disturbances like wildfire and disease that impact carbon stocks. So WRI is now working with the University of Maryland. This is the project that Adil mentioned under the Carbon Monitoring System grant. We are connected through the U.S. Climate Alliance and our work with state agencies in Maryland and in Delaware. We're now working with them to create a carbon inventory system for those states based on existing LiDAR data paired with satellite information on forest loss and some of their own field data in order to create a remote sensing informed product that would really be the first of its kind to estimate carbon fluxes in those states on a yearly basis. We hope that within a couple years, this methodology will replace the existing field-based methodology in those state inventories. We're starting to work with them on that right now. And ultimately, I'd like to see this become the national standard for how you measure carbon fluxes in forests and trees outside of forests, because I think there's a number of ways that it improves on current methods, including greater spatial resolution, attribution of disturbances, and capturing trees outside of forests, which right now often fall through the cracks in the inventory.
Alex,
Yes.
One quick question. Claus Scott mentions, can someone point me to the NAS publication mentioned here? I understand it's the Gable survey.
Yeah, the NAS publication is the R&D roadmap for negative emissions technologies. It's publicly available online. I'm happy to find and send the link if others can't do that. So finally, just on this point, we believe there's other applications of remote sensing data that are less well developed but could become important carbon monitoring tools. Those include assessing the carbon impacts of forest degradation by using new parameters in satellite data like greenness to look at forest health, and monitoring soil carbon data with a regularly updated national soil carbon map. And then lastly, I just want to touch on the data system suggestion here, which you could imagine NASA being involved in partnership with USDA or maybe EPA. That would involve developing a centralized platform for federal data on carbon sequestration so that researchers both in government agencies and outside in academia and civil society could access that data and draw their own conclusions about how effective these practices and policies are at accelerating carbon sequestration in the landscape. So as you see across kind of all of these suggestions, research is a major part of developing the enabling environment to bring carbon removal approaches like tree restoration and soil carbon management to scale in the US. I think NASA can play a big role in that, so I'm excited to have the discussion with you all of what potential you see. And with that, we can go to Q&A. Thank you so much for being here and for listening.
Would you like your guests to be able to unmute their own lines by pressing *6? If all guests have been muted, you will now rejoin the meeting. by pressing star 6.
I think they're gonna have to just hit *6 if they want.
You have to hit *6 individually, I think.
Okay. So they can do it now?
Yeah, they should be
Okay.
able to do it now.
Okay, so we're gonna move to the Q&A session, and the people that are online, you can unmute using *6, or you can just copy your question on the chat. So I don't know if I can go over your shirt. Great presentation, thank you. He has several questions. What trees are being considered in the tree restoration? Are they native species or non-native fast growers?
That's a great question. Our analysis there did not get down into the level of forest type. We actually built that recommendation or that analysis on previous work by the Nature Conservancy that kind of looks spatially at reforestation. And actually, I have another slide back here that kind of looks at the makeup of the tree restoration wedge. So we do think that native species are likely appropriate in most circumstances. That's why I mentioned that we'd want safeguards around putting the right tree in the right place. But tree restoration also includes, putting trees on the landscape for other reasons. So for example, in silvopasture and cropland agroforestry systems, it might make most sense to plant trees that would provide some kind of additional economic benefit to the landowner, whether that's fruit or nut trees or trees that can be harvested for timber. Those likely wouldn't be native species necessarily. There may be other instances where existing timber plantations could be improved to increase carbon sequestration. Those may not be native species. I think the bulk of the opportunity really would be in putting trees that belong on the landscape back where they belong. But there's also a variety of other considerations we want to consider there. Yes?
Have you already done a map of where land is available in these different land uses?
Yes.
Repeat the question.
Sure. The question was about if we've done a map of where land is available in these different land uses for tree restoration. That's a great question. We do have data at the state level. The analysis that the Nature Conservancy did that informs our reforestation assessment is more granular than that. They're planning on publishing that data, I think, very soon. And so we don't want to get out ahead of them and publish our interpretation of the data before they have a chance to do that. But all of our data is at least as granular as the state level, and we hope to be able to make that public again once the Nature Conservancy has had a chance to publish their own data. Yes?
So in making choices about the kinds of trees to plant in a given location, are you taking into account the changing climate, the changes in temperature and precipitation?
Definitely. An example of how we considered that, and again, for folks that may not have heard, the question was about if we're taking into account the changing climate and changing conditions when thinking about tree restoration. And I've heard folks say that restoration is really not the best term because we're not trying to look backwards here. We're really trying to look forwards about what kinds of ecosystems make sense in the climate that we're coming into rather than the one we're coming out of. So for example, when we talk about restocking, and that's increasing tree biomass in existing forests, we recognize that in some areas it may not be desirable to actually increase the forest density because you're already dealing with increased wildfire risks, massive kind of insect and disease outbreaks. Those are particularly worrisome in the western U.S., where you have the drier conditions and more wildfire outbreaks. So when we looked at restocking forests, we actually were conservative and just eliminated any potential in the western U.S., only looked at the eastern U.S., where the literature indicates that restoring more trees to existing forests actually increase their climate resilience and would make them healthier going forward.
One question online, and then we can go to questions here, is I just lost this question. What about the potential carbon price that might make growing trees more profitable than some, I just lost that. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, I can speak broadly to how a carbon price would impact all of this. Obviously, people in my field have been thinking and talking about carbon prices for the last number of decades. We still don't have a national carbon price, and it's not clear, when and if that will happen. Of course, if it does happen, there's, still a number of questions to be answered about how such a carbon price would incentivize carbon removal technologies or natural approaches. I think there's been an assumption in the community for a while now that any kind of carbon pricing system would include offsets for things like forestry and agricultural soil. If we do end up with a system that includes offsets that leverages private capital to pay for some of these carbon sequestration, that's great. But I think we should not assume that any kind of private incentive from a carbon price would actually be great enough to incentivize that kind of action we need at the scale we need on the landscape. I'll say that existing carbon markets like the cap and trade system in California, which does allow for offsets in the forestry system, actually does not really allow in practice for a lot of landowners that could contribute to forest carbon sequestration to participate in the program, because the administrative requirements are so rigorous, and the kind of the environmental monitoring piece is so costly that it's just not feasible for a lot of landowners to play. And so, we think the appropriate way to address this problem is through public subsidies, because it's really a problem of public goods. The federal government has the resources to address it. Really, in the scheme of things that we're talking about doing to address climate change, this is not a big dollar amount, and that would be able to leverage the action we need on the scale and time frame that we need it. But of course, there could be a role for private capital if we had something like a carbon pricing system.
So we have, I'm going to go to two more here. We have more than 40 people online, and there are several questions. So Gianni Tresta, she's from the U.S. Carbon Cycle Science Program. It's a great presentation. Alex, during your research, did you look into how we could leverage existing federal partnerships in carbon cycle research and enhance existing collaborations? Like, for example, the one U.S. Carbon Cycle Science Program with Carbon Cycle Interagency Working Group and NACP, that is the North American Carbon Program platforms, and others.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question, and I think could be a fruitful topic for Q&A or discussions kind of after this. As I mentioned, our suggestions on what we could do to enhance the enabling environment were not a prioritized set of recommendations as kind of the other policies were. So these are really more intended to be suggestions for further discussions. We did not get into how this would work at an agency level or what kind of existing collaborations would need to be in place. There's some instances where we called out existing data sets or agency programs that could be leveraged, and so some of that's in the paper. But I think I would really turn this over to you all who have more of the agency institutional knowledge and understand more of the partnerships and collaborations to think through what recommendations or suggestions here could fit in with your existing collaborations or could be the foundation of new partnerships.
Go ahead with the phone.
One more on phone. Could you, Susan Meinmeyer mentions, could you comment about actions being taken at the state level regarding carbon removal, especially tree restoration and agriculture?
Yeah, great question. And Susan is a former WRI colleague, so great to have her participation here as well. So as I mentioned a little bit of this in the context of the CMS grant that we're working on now with the University of Maryland, but WRI is actually a technical assistance partner of the U.S. Climate Alliance, which is now a group of 25 governors throughout the United States that's committed to climate action to help meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. We are specifically working with them on their Natural and Working Lands Challenge, which commits states that sign on to the challenge to a number of actions across carbon inventories, policy, and planning actions to enhance the carbon sinks in their natural and working lands within 2 years. So we're now working with states all over the country on that. In terms of policies, there's largely in early stages, there's been a few actions. I know Rhode Island, for example, is going all in on a strategy to enhance their urban forest cover. There's a few states who have developed healthy soils programs that will compensate farmers that do cover cropping or implement other practices that help to sequester carbon in soils. I know California has targets for kind of ecosystem restoration across the board and are leveraging some of their cap and trade revenues to help fund those programs. A lot of other states we're working with are thinking about how to create greenhouse gas inventories for the land sector for the first time because up to this point, the data that's been available to them through existing tools hasn't always been reliable or precise enough to really meet their needs. And so this, again, is another area where NASA products and remote sensing tools could be really transformative in helping more states kind of understand the carbon balance in their natural and working lands and actually lead them to set policies and help manage those resources, which, when they're not able to measure them, it's very much harder to do.
Okay. There was another seminar which I was at, which had a slightly shocking or rather surprising conclusion. It seemed to suggest that trees put out volatile organic compounds and terpenes and things like that, which break down into CO and CO2, and put out as much or more than they capture. Have you ever come across that, or what would you do with a conclusion like that?
No, I mean, it's an interesting topic. I've looked into some of this just for folks that couldn't hear. The question was about trees emitting volatile organic compounds that actually have a net warming effect and could, in some cases, maybe offset any kind of climate cooling value from carbon sequestration. That's not the only concern there. There's also a concern that trees can increase the albedo of the Earth's surface, actually absorbing more heat and having a radiative forcing that would actually offset the carbon sequestration value. And the Nature Conservancy in their work kind of makes an assumption that offsets a certain part of the carbon sequestration to account for the albedo effects. I've looked into all of this a little bit in the course of the research for this, and largely found that the science is still very much evolving. I don't think there's conclusions that we can draw at this point across the US about the net effects. It can be very regionally and system dependent. In the interest of consistency across the different kind of pathways and technologies that we're looking at, we decided to only represent the carbon sequestration value and exclude any effects from albedo, VOCs, or there's other systems trees have that can actually contribute more cooling, and so there's forces that go both ways. Right, exactly, and like in urban environments, it can reduce urban heat island effects. So the picture certainly is much more complicated than just a formula to go from number of trees to carbon sequestered and to climate impacts. I know there's existing research underway now, including stuff that's affiliated with NASA, that's hoping to better answer those questions, especially around albedo, but maybe around some of the other factors as well. And if we get more data and a better understanding, I think certain iterations of this could certainly stack up those benefits and see how it changes the picture. My own sense is that when we're looking at a temperate environment like the United States, the effect is not strong enough to dramatically change our conclusions in most cases. It may change them on a state or a regional basis, like in the Intermountain West specifically, where you have trees over a lot of snow cover. There may be more offsetting effects, but in general, I think it's a matter of degree, not of not of directionality of our findings.
We might have maybe 2-3 more minutes. I want to go over 2 questions that seem very important, and then we're going to stay here for people that want to stay after the seminar. Joe Rudee mentions, what remote sensing approach are you thinking could help in creating a regularly update soil carbon map?
What remote sensing approaches? Yeah, that's a great question. I think this is an emerging area that will probably require more R&D still than some of the other suggestions here. I know through University of Maryland there's a carbon monitoring system project called the Cropland Carbon Monitoring System, CCMS, that looked at cropland areas and assessed the kind of the net ecosystem carbon balance within those areas. I don't know the details much more intimately than that, but I think research like that that looks specifically at agricultural areas and is able to sort of map carbon balances, emissions, or sequestration to specific areas and soil types and that sort of thing would be a helpful first step. There's also remote sensing applications paired with machine learning that can actually identify cropping systems like cover cropping or no-till on the landscape, and pairing that kind of work with this ecosystem carbon balance work could eventually help us better attribute soil carbon sequestration in different places to different practices happening on that land.
And one last question from Chad. Keith Boston mentions, do you think all the recent carbon neutral commitments from big companies like Microsoft, Amazon, Delta, BP will help drive some of these carbon removal strategies?
That's a great question. We certainly hope that they will. We're actually, as we speak, trying to scope out an innovation hub for corporate actors that are invested in carbon removal to help them think through the most innovative and impactful ways that their commitments can help benefit the climate and accelerate progress across all of these strategies. Certainly private sector dollars are real and can be significant across some of these commitments. So I hope that we can use them in a way that will also leverage public resources to make the most progress we can. I don't think it's appropriate to put all of the onus on the private sector to solve this problem, since it really is a problem of public goods, but I certainly think their resources can be useful and very well targeted.
So thank you. I think we're about time. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much for coming.